The budget revision. You're up. There we go.
All right, President Miller, members of the board, Dr. Driscoll, thanks for having me tonight to talk about the budget revision. So if you remember, we had some budgets back in June, and they were somewhat of placeholder budgets because the deadline for us to do our budgets, we didn't actually have budget information and budget documents from the state in time for that. So we did it for compliance purposes, and that we did those budgets with kind of the understanding that we're just going to come back here and revise it in September, and that is what we were doing. So when there's any changes that the legislature does late, you have until September 15th where you can do another revision for that. So that's what we're going to do. The revision is kind of nice because we're able to, you have to kind of guess what your enrollment is going to be when you do it in June. When you do it now, we actually have a much better idea of what it is. And all of the funding is based on enrollment, so it's going to be more exact. And then a lot of times we'll have to do a revision in December, and how that works is the state in October will take a look at your actual enrollment, do a calculation, and figure out whether the funding that you should be getting is more than 1% less than what you had in your adopted budget. And if it is, due to a drop of enrollment, then you have to do a budget revision. This will probably keep us from having to do a budget revision in December because we're already factoring in the drop of enrollment now. It is going to be a fairly thorough presentation, just sort of showing you how the whole budget process works and then how the whole tax rate systems work as well. So it's going to get pretty detailed in there, but I think it'll be very informative, and especially because we have had such a large drop of enrollment, I think it'll be very enlightening on there. So just the differences from the adopted budget to now, drop of about 115 ADM, 115 students. And as I've said for the last few years, when we have lower ADM, we have less money. And that will be on display here as well. Okay, so we're going to get into the budget formula and how we actually get the funding from the state, how they comes about. So it's really just a lot of calculations based on how many students we have. So the main driver is our average daily membership. So that is enrollment. Doesn't matter. I mean, we want the kids to come to school, but if Johnny doesn't come to school on Tuesday, we still get money for that as long as they are enrolled in school. So we've got the ADM, and then we've got weights. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about the different weights that we have for the students. So this is the type, or the group A weight. So preschoolers get us a little more funding than a second grader, for example. But everybody actually gets you more than a 1.0 on that, so everybody has a little bit of weight. And that's our weighted group A weight. About 10,600 on there is that standard group A. Then we go into the group B weights, and those are more dependent on if the students qualify for the various categories. And they tend to have higher funding for higher needs students. So there's varying weights on there. So if you're a visually impaired student, you're going to have, I think, about 4.8 additional weight. So the school district is almost getting, they're getting about 5.8 student equivalent funding for that student because it's more expensive to educate that student. So there's various weights on there on different disability categories. Even K3 gets an additional added weight on there. So those, kindergartners through third grade get us extra funding because the state has considered those a little more costly to educate. Gifted, we get next to nothing for the gifted weights, but we still get a little bit of there. They added the free and reduced, so essentially they kind of treat that as a poverty weight. And that's one of the things where, because we went all free and reduced last year, now all students qualify in that weight. So we actually do get additional funding for that, regardless of how much income that student actually, or excuse me, how much income that the family of that student has. they still qualify under the free and reduced weight plan. So we get a little bit of money. Do you have a question right now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Just a quick question. You have under ELL, K3 and then K3 reading. Can you explain the difference between that and then if kids qualify for both of those weights?
They do qualify for both of those weights. So you can see, if I could go back, it's identical amounts there. So it's just different weights. I can't tell you the historic reason why the state has split them up that way, but they are different weights for those kids. And all you have to do is be K3. There's no special aspect for it. So all the students are the same. Okay, so got the various funding amounts, and so then our additional weighted ADM that we get, 2,800 students. That's essentially an extra 2,800 students that we're getting funded for based on those weights that we have. So it's really important, and we work with the special education department to make sure that we have the students categorized in the correct funding, because they can qualify for multiple different categories. And ideally, you would have them qualify whatever is the actual true one, but the higher weight one, so you get that funding, because we're going to be providing those services for whatever that disability is. So we want to get the funding for it as well. So it's important to make sure we identify the right one. So we take all those weights, the group A weight, the group B weight, add them together, and we're about 13,700. And then we've got our base support level of $5,013 per student. So that's the same for everybody. That's statewide. So when we talk about, the state increased funding by 2%, this is what they're increasing generally, is this 5,013. It would have been a little less last year, and then they increased it by the 2%. So that's where that funding comes in. So that multiplies out, the 13 times the 5,013 gets us 68.6 million is our pre-adjusted base support level. And so we'll get a little bit extra on there. So we've got the audit service expense that the state actually gives us a reimbursement for that. It's a funded mandate. We're used to the unfunded mandates. So they do give us a little bit. So that's why it's a little different than the last page. And then we also get some transportation money there. And so then the main thing that we get, 71.4 million, that's the revenue control limit. So that is the basic amount. And this is the calculation. It's different numbers for each district, but that is the same basic calculation every district gets. You look at your group A weights, your group B weights, and you multiply by the 5,013 and you get to this amount. So we're gonna use the RCL on a lot of different things for the calculations, but that's kind of the basic funding that we get from the state. So that basic funding we get from the state is all ADM driven, okay? So we saw all of that, and if we've been talking about ADM has been decreasing for a number of years, and I've got some charts here for you. So if you look at the unweighted ADM column, that's your group A weight, and that has dropped. You know, when I started at the district in 2019, or in 2020, we're at 10,900. We're down to 9,300. If we had just maintained the same level of enrollment, we'd have about $9 million more every year to spend. And that's probably an underestimate, because that's just adjusting the group A weight. You imagine losing 1,600 students, you're also gonna lose some group B sides of it, because a lot of those kids are gonna be K3, a lot of those kids have different qualifications. That was a little too complicated for this quick estimate. So just looking at that, we're looking at 9 million. Even just if we had maintained from FY23, that's an extra $3 million. So when we have those decreases of enrollment, this is where it impacts us. And we don't have that money for positions. We don't have that as much money for raises. So ESSER has covered up a lot of this stuff, but ESSER's going away. So that's why this is really, really important. Okay, continuing on with the general budget limit, the GBL. So this is a common thing we use in here. So we've got our RCL that we talked about before, that's 71.4. That's the basic amount we get. The DAA, again, every district gets that based on enrollment. So that's something everybody gets. You can move the DAA around, so you could put it all in M&O, you could put it all in capital, you could split it. So we're splitting it up with more of it going to M&O because we need it there, but you can kind of move it however you want, depending on which funds you need more money in. And now we start to differentiate by some districts because we are lucky that our voters have passed the overrides. And so the M&O override gets us about 10.8 million. That is based on ADM, so that changes every year. It's based on last year's ADM, so it kind of lags a little bit. So when they changed to current year funding, they didn't change this part of current year funding, so it's still based on last year's ADM. And then we've got our DAA override. So that is flat, $5 million. It's technically 10% of the RCL or $5 million, whichever is less. So if you see our RCL is 71 million, 5 million is much less than 10% of that. And so that's also where we talked about the override for this year, changing that on the ballot to 7 million or 10% of the RCL, because that RCL has just increased so much. And it's been 5 million for 20 years, and we talked about before, the purchasing power of that $5 million is just a lot less now than it was in 2004, when it was still $5 million. But those are some nice additions to our budget when we have the overrides there of that 10 million and 5 million. Continuing on the general budget limit, we've got the desegregation funding. So 13.6 million for that, and that is a static figure. So when the state increases funding 2% or 4%, that doesn't change. That's still the same amount. When our enrollment decreases by 2%, that doesn't change. So it's good and bad, it just stays where it is, okay? Doesn't really move. Then we've got our budget balance carry forward. That's just everything we didn't spend last year comes on in for this year. It is higher than it has normally been because of ESSER, and I would say it's actually probably gonna get even larger this year because we have some more expenses that we're moving over to ESSER that will free up more M&O dollars. But that is, I wanna say, artificially inflated because of ESSER. When various expenses popped up that normally would go to M&O, we could cover it in ESSER. ESSER's going away as of September 30th. So that's no longer a safety net for us there. And then moving down to the bottom of it, we get an extra 600,000 each year, or about 600,000 for Prop 123. This is the last year of that. There was additional funds from Prop 123 when it passed that went into the funding formula, and that's just baked into that funding amount there. But this is the special amount separated.
About Prop 123, that number varies. The amount we receive from Prop 123 may vary over a year, correct?
Yes, this is what I believe it's 75 million divided by a per pupil basis. So depending on how other districts go up and down, like this will change. It's not gonna be 643,000 exactly. It'll definitely change as the enrollment changes throughout the state.
And is it just based on district enrollment, or is it also dependent, since it's a state land trust, on like market volatility?
No, it's, I believe it's just 75 million that's divided on a per pupil basis. So if enrollment goes up in other districts, our money would go down because the pie is set for this. But this is the last year that we're gonna get this funding anyway.
If it doesn't renew, correct. Thank you.
Thank you, President Miller. Quick question about the Prop 123. What enrollment count do they use? Do they use October 1, just like all the other ones?
I believe they just use the Group A weighted ADM.
Okay, thank you.
So the total amount for our M&O budget for this year is $108 million. Now, when we then have the budget on page 1 of the budget, we're gonna budget to capacity because that's what you have to do to get carryover. We're not gonna plan to spend all of that money, but we're gonna fill out that budget so that we're budgeting every dollar so that we maximize that budget capacity so that if we don't spend it, it rolls over into the next year. Then the capital side, 6.2 million. That's just the current year funding that we're gonna get, but it's gonna add to the funding formula that I'm gonna talk about here in a second. But that 1.8, that's set, that's our limit for M&O. So for the capital budget limit, it's pretty simple. You start with how much the budget limit was last year, how much you spent last year, get you the carryover. We've historically carried a higher balance on the carryover in case the override fails, because there's no step down on the DA override. If it's not there, it's gone. So to give you a little bit of cushion so that make sure that if it does not pass and we're not in a dire situation right away, we've kept a larger balance in there. We add the current year funding, the 6.2 million that we had before, to get us the total amount of 18.6 million that we've got in capital for the year. So most of that 6.2 million, that's enrollment driven still. We've got a large carryover amount that helps as well. But again, it's all comes back to the enrollment.
And I think a few years ago, or not, a few months ago, you gave us a projection 5 years of what that carryover over year. And in 5 years, there would be much of that.
It'll probably go down because we have a much higher carryover because of ESSER, and it'll give us that cushion to spread that out a little bit. But yeah, it's likely to go down. It's hard to predict 5 years from now. Hopefully enrollment comes back and we're a little better, but we'll probably spend it down a little bit. So on the summary for the budget, like I've said before, the enrollment is funding. And if the enrollment is down, the money is down, and our money is down. 108 million in M&O, 18 million in capital. We do have those higher carryover balances, but again, those are kind of artificially inflated due to ESSER. And ESSER is not going to be around in 26 days. So something that we will need to be looking at. Dr. Driscoll and I have already talked a good bit about what we need to do to make sure that the lack of ESSER does not impact us severely. Okay, now we're going to talk about tax rates. So if that wasn't exciting enough for you, we're going to get nitty gritty on the taxes too. All right, so this is the summary. The headline right there, tax rates are decreasing. So makes everybody happy on that one. But I believe there's going to be a little bit of confusion this year because the desegregation tax rate has been in the primary for a number of years. It is the state and the county are moving it over to the secondary, okay? And so even though it's staying the same, when you're gonna, and I haven't seen the tax bills yet with it, but the secondary rate lists out the capital, or lists out the overrides, lists out the bonds, and I'm assuming it's gonna list out the desegregation as well. So you're gonna probably have a lot of voters who are looking at their tax bill and they're gonna look at 24 and 25, and they had nothing for desegregation for the secondary in 24, and all of a sudden they're gonna have a tax rate in 25 and think it's a big tax increase. They're probably not gonna look at their primary rate significantly dropping because the deseg had been kind of buried in the primary rate, and on your tax bill it just showed primary rate. So your primary rate's gonna plummet and your secondary rate is gonna increase, but overall the taxes are gonna go down. So if we get anything as far as the headline for taxes, it's the taxes are going down a little bit, but I'm very sure that we're gonna get people calling confused and angry that the tax rate went up, when it's really the presentation of it more so than anything. It's just shifting it from the primary to the secondary. Okay, so how we figure out those tax rates, they're determined in June and July, and we're gonna use a lot of the same terms like the RCL and DAA, but remember, those were June and July RCL numbers, and it's based on enrollment, and so those numbers are gonna be different than the numbers we just talked about. So you might say, well, that's not the RCL we just had, it's because of the timing of it. So it'll be a little bit different. So we worked with the county school superintendent, Heather Ma, to set the tax rates for that. So we worked with her on it, and we basically just figure out, all right, we need our RCL, we got our DAA, and that's our equalization base. That's how much we need to get per the funding formula, okay? Then we figure out, okay, how much taxable valuation property do we have in the district? And then we have the QTR, that's the qualifying tax rate, and it's statewide, it's 1.593 A unified district would essentially be double that. So if you're just an elementary or just a high school district, it's going to be this right here. And then it's a pretty simple calculation of, all right, the QTR times the valuation gets us how much is going to be levied by the taxpayers. And then we have the equalization amount. So that's how much is the difference between how much is levied to the taxpayers and how much the funding formula says we need to get. So the state makes up that difference, and that's the equalization part. If you've heard of non-state aid districts, that's what this is an example of. Their valuation is so high on their property that the valuation times the QTR covers everything that they need. So the state doesn't have to pitch anything in. The districts still get the same amount because it's all formula based. It's just where it's coming from.
How does what happened in Scottsdale and other districts so that factor what these
They receive the same amount, and any additional will go to the state fund to then be equalized out.
when they were assessed and school districts were on the hook to pay back the property owners?
So that is, they have to levy for additional taxes on that. So we had enough extra cash that we did not have to do that. But I think a few districts like Scottsdale, Mesa, they're going to get a recalculation from the state to cover some of it, but the rest of it they're going to have to levy to get that funding. Okay. All right. So continuing on with the primary rate, the vast majority of the primary tax rate is that QTR, the qualifying tax rate. If you see, there's some other slight parts of it in the primary, but the total primary rate at 1.62 when the QTR is 1.59, the vast majority is just that QTR amount. The secondary rate, that's where it's going to have a little more fluctuation by district, because the QTR, every district has that same QTR regardless of where you are, as long as you're double if you're unified. But the secondary rates are going to be a little different because those are going to be generally some specialty areas like more voter approved taxes. So how we figure out how much the tax rate is for the bonds, for example, is we figure out how much we need to pay. So we've got payments due in July and January. And then this year we added an additional $6 million because we're going to be selling bonds in November, December. And so we need some additional money to pay the interest and principal for that. So we figure out how much we need, about $45 million. And we figure out how much cash do we have now. And then we just figure that what the remaining amount, again, it's simple math, that's how much we need to levy, $21 million. And so we just take the valuation and back into the rate based on how high we need to set that rate to bring in $21 million. So it's always fluctuating depending on how much we need. It's not a set rate every year and then we build up a surplus or something like that. It's all dependent on, all right, how much do we need to make sure that we pay our bills? Very similar for the overrides and desegregation. We figure out how much we need to levy, and then just back into those rates based on the valuation. So there's not a lot of hard math on it. We just have to make sure we get all the figures from the county for the valuations, get the RCL and the ADM that we have, and how much that we need, to pay for the bonds or the overrides, and then the rates just kind of fall into place depending on what we need. So in the summary on the tax rates, they're all based on the assessed value and how much cash we need. Like I said, as valuations go up, the rates go down. So that's where that $5 million we were talking about, we needed $5 million, so the rate would be set here. Well, as the valuation goes up, we still need $5 million, so the rate can go down because we still only need to bring in $5 million. And then the thing I want people to remember is that desegregation has moved from the primary to the secondary, and I believe it will cause a lot of confusion, at least for this year, because you're gonna, unless, and I haven't seen the tax bills of how the county is gonna present it, but I'm assuming it's gonna be going from nothing to something. And people are gonna be confused by that and probably calling, I know they'll be calling me, they'll probably be calling you. They might be calling their schools, but it's something that is out of our control as to how it's presented. But we can say overall, the tax rates in total are decreasing. All right, if we've got any additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Thompson. One thing, thank you for being so transparent on this. I know that you had a lot of slides that you had to put together and just do it by individual thing. Some people have book reading clubs. I will have a budget reading going over wine party with some girlfriends in my neighborhood so they can see it, but I actually feel like I can explain it. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for letting us know that that presentation on the tax bill is going to be different. Because that's going to be a big deal, especially as we've been going out for override and the overrides and telling people that it's not going to cost them more. They're still not going to be charged more. One question that I had that the public will ask, not getting into the weeds because some people will not get in the weeds, but they understand that we're not supported on preschool. And when you look at this and you were talking about preschool and the weight, can you explain to the community why the weight's higher and what does that mean for us?
So we actually do get supported if the preschooler qualifies for disability. So the Tempe Pre's or the Kinder Prep that we have that are more tuition-based, we get no additional funding from the state on that. But if there's a special needs preschooler that is going to get, we do get funding from the state for that.
Okay, so that's where that's coming in. And then the second question that I had is something that's not in these equations, but I know it's separated out in our budget, is healthcare costs are increasing at an alarming rate. How does this play in the budget? And we are not getting from the state any extra resources in order to compensate the exorbitant amount of costs is that correct? Of
That's
what
correct.
we are enduring. So the higher that it continues to go, these things are going to be, every single one of these lines is going to be affected and having to contribute to that. Is that correct?
So most of those lines are the funding side mostly. So we talked about that's how we get our money. So that 108 million, that's the pie that we have to cut up. So as the healthcare costs increase, that piece of pie for healthcare costs gets bigger, and it leaves us less for the rest. So it leaves us less for positions or less for raises. And so that's how it impacts us. We get no extra funding from the state for any healthcare costs. So it's
So I
just
think
going to
that's
take away
my
that.
main question for the public to understand, that as prices increase in certain areas, we are not being supplemented with a weight on several things that are continuing to go up.
We got a
Major percentage
2% increase.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a great presentation. It's taken me about 20 years to get to this point, and I'm going to save this.
Took me about that long to put it together.
The question I had on slide 45, you talked about the total assessed valuation. What was it last year, and what is it this year?
I can go find that. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it has been increasing. And so as that valuation increases, that's where the rates can
rates go down
a little bit.
Okay.
It was around that same amount, but it was definitely lower. It has increased.
Yeah, because we've had tremendous amount of growth,
Yes.
high-rise growth, and so I assumed it was going way up. And I don't know what that'll do to homeowners or people that have lived in the same place for a while, what their tax rate will be.
Well, that's the thing where your valuation can go up, but depending on if we're not needing more money, then their taxes are not going to go up, because that $5 million, we still, if you have, 100 people paying into that $5 million and their homes skyrocket in value, well, we're still, those same 100 people still pay that $5 million. They're going to pay the same amount. The rates would go down, but the actual dollars would be all the same.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Eric, it was great. I know what to tell my next door neighbor, Beverly, when she hits me again.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this is one of those questions, this isn't really a question, more of a public service announcement. So we get, for a general ed student, $5,013 per student.
Yes, with the weight of a standard K-8 student of 1.15, it's about 5,800, but yeah.
Okay. And then the ESA voucher, if I chose to take my child out of public school, is between $6,000 and $7,000. Is that accurate, if I remember correctly?
That sounds correct.
So if I correctly recall, ESA vouchers were originally designated for special ed students who couldn't get adequate services within their local public schools. So that would make sense, right, with the weight, that they would need extra money for extra services, right? So I guess the PSA would be that taxpayers like to have standardization for roads and utility poles and libraries, but we don't seem to care that the state certifies teachers and says this teacher is qualified to educate the population, and we're going to give more people, more money to individuals that have probably no qualifications or minimal qualifications, certainly not state certified qualifications. We're going to give them more money to educate their children, right? Is that how I'm understanding the dollar figures attached to those?
That seems to be your understanding.
Just want to make sure. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Eric, sorry, you're not off the hook yet. So one other question, how do we factor in our students for McKinney-Vento?
So they would still be in that funding formula, just like standard students, but then we would have additional funding in the McKinney-Vento grants. So depending on how many students we have in that, they would be in there. But they're not separate, they don't have a separate weight in the general fund funding formula. That would be on the federal grant side. So they would probably qualify for the free and reduced lunch weight. If they had any disabilities, they would qualify for that. But there's no special weight for those types of students.
So to I guess highlight, when we transport students like across town or across the state, there's not necessarily any additional funding from the state for that.
There is some funding formula based on miles driven and students transported. So there is a slight amount of that. But if you saw, all of the transportation funding is $2.7 million. So in the grand scheme of things, it's 2.5% of the general fund. So it's there, and the extra mileage that you might get for McKinney-Vento might factor in slightly on that, but it's not a whole lot.
Thank you.
All righty. Now, after hearing that budget, we can stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
I'd like to make a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
Second?
A motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. 501, approval modification of minutes from the August 21st Governing Board meeting.
So moved.
Second?
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. 502, approval modification of the minutes from the August 21st executive session.
So moved.
Second?
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. 601, approval of tonight's consent agenda.
I'd like to make a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda.
Second?
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. As part of our consent agenda, I wanted to thank John Brewski, Sprouts Healthy Communities, and Musical Instrument Museum for their donations. Mr. McGinney, do we have anyone here tonight? No? All righty. Moving on to 7:01, Celebrate Excellence. Dr. Driscoll.
I don't know how I go after Eric's presentation. In simple math, Eric, simple math. All right, I have a few items for Celebrate Excellence, if this works. There we go. Blue Cross Blue Shield recently gave the Thai Foundation $5,000 to support students in need of eyeglasses. $1,000 will be given to Frank, Thu, Nevitt, Wood, and Shamley to support at least 10 students with 2 pairs of glasses, 1 for school and 1 for at home. Thank you to our Director of Wraparound Services, Michelle Grimaldi, who helped coordinate this donation. A big congratulations to Ward Traditional Academy 4th grade teacher Allison Ganso, who was recently awarded $2,500 by KTR as part of their monthly program called Tribute to a Teacher. Teachers can be nominated by members of the communities they serve. This year marks Allison's 10th year at Ward Traditional Academy. Part of Allison's award is attributed to her longtime participation in Pen Pals for Seniors, a program that provides an opportunity for students and senior citizens to connect through one-on-one letter writing. I think one of our parents is up here, one of the students that participated in that. I think so. I might be making that up. Allison, plans to donate part of her prize money to support supplies and other expenses running the program. If you know of any of other deserving TD3 teachers, you can nominate them at ktr.com. Congratulations again to Allison, and thank you for your dedication and care of our students at Ward Traditional Academy. The East Valley Assistance League recently supported more than 40 students from Tempe Elementary Schools by providing new school clothes through their Operation School Bell event. Each student, accompanied by their parents, received $100 to spend on shoes and clothing at Target during the event. Thank you to the Assistance League for their long-standing partnership and support of this program. A special shout out to our social service team who played a key role in identifying students and ensuring that the event ran smoothly. And that concludes my Celebrate Excellence.
8:01, presentation on the ESEA Consolidated Budget Update. Dr. Hargrave.
Good evening, President Miller, members of the Governing Board, Dr. Driscoll. Per your request, wanted to give you an update on some of our school improvement funding. So ESEA, also known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was enacted back in 1965. We've had various iterations, but all of that has to do with our commitment to equal opportunities in education for students. On the left, you'll see some of the components of the ESEA, which has to do with Title I, our low-income students. Title II is another portion of that grant, effective teachers and leaders. Title III deals with our English learning students. Title IV is where we fund support and enrichment activities like well-rounded education, effective use of technology, things like that. And then we also have a portion TSI, targeted school improvement. So just a little background on how the funding formula works. At the federal level is where it begins. The Federal Board of Education allocates funding to states through a formula-based approach. The allocation is primarily based on factors such as the number of low-income students in each state. So that is determined using data like the Census Bureau's estimates of children in poverty. Those funds are then distributed through these various programs that were mentioned, with Title I being the largest of the portions focused on improving education for disadvantaged students. Like I mentioned, these funds are intended to support educational equity, improve quality of education for all of our students, and ensure that students have access to the resources that they need to succeed. If you'll note in this chart, it is data from the US Census, the small area income and poverty estimates. So looking across the years, the allocation is notably Arizona going from 1997 to all the way to 2022 is our most recent data. There's notable changes in poverty estimates, kind of varying throughout. Fluctuations based on what's happening in the economy, the Great Recession, COVID-19 pandemic. But overall, through the past decades, Arizona's trends have really mirrored the national patterns with a little bit higher of a rate of poverty than the overall US. It's not until the most recent years, you'll note at that arrow, where for the first time, Arizona saw much more of a stabilization, and we have our poverty levels actually dip below the US rates. So some of this is where you may remember back in April, the state did have some huge cuts made to our title funding. That came out in a lot of communication, and that was in anticipation of this variance. So for the first time, our poverty rates were down below the US, and so the state overall was being overly conservative with what allocations they were anticipating. At the state level, so again, this is all formula-based. The federal dollars come to the state, and there are set-asides required within the ESEA portions, specifically under Title I. So even though TSI seems like a separate fund, under Title I for low-income students, there are state-required set-asides. A minimum of 7% of the state allocation must be dedicated to school improvement activities, specifically to support comprehensive needs of struggling schools. States may use these funds directly, or they can choose to distribute them to local education agencies like districts through a competitive or formula grant process. So here in Arizona, the process is there's a competitive grant application where, like we do here, we can put in an application for all of our qualifying schools identified federally as needing targeted school improvement for subgroups of students that may not be growing and achieving at the same rates as their peers, so that we get an eligibility qualification there. We're able to apply, make a proposal of how we would use that additional funding, and then the state is able to approve funds within that 7% set aside. You may have also heard recently in the news that Arizona has about $29 million of Title I funding that they did not realize was going to expire. And so without doing anything, taking any action, that funding at the state level would be sent back to the federal government. Fortunately, there is a waiver process. Where we are in that process right now, the state has applied for a waiver with the federal government. We are actually in the public comment period. It closes in the next week or two. It gives stakeholders the opportunity to share how they would like to see the funding used. However, we, one, don't know if the waiver will be approved, and two, the state has no obligation to send the money to the district level. So essentially, they could keep it at the district level for school improvement activities. They could give it to the districts, but there's no guarantee of that. Just to give you a brief overview and the changes from last year's allocations for Tempe to this year. In FY24, fiscal year 24, we received an initial allocation of about 3.3 million for Title I. This year, we were down to approximately 3.1. So one thing that I will say is that was about a 7% decrease, where we know Mr. Thompson already talked about our decreasing enrollment. However, we did a better job of capturing our poverty counts this go around. So our poverty rates increased from 60% to the 75%, which is where I would attribute that to. We didn't have a full 10% cut like many districts saw. We only went to about 7% reduction. The decrease has impacted a lot of areas, including specifically the per pupil allocation at the site levels. So last year, sites were seeing approximately $476 per student that qualified for free and reduced lunch, compared to this year at $340. Another thing to note is our private schools. We have about 10 private schools that we work with on a regular basis who do get a proportionate share of these funds. So while it may seem like a smaller reduction in funds, they still get the same, if not more, funding than they did before. So that comes off the top of our funding as well. When looking at the other areas of Title II, Title III, and Title IV, we had similar reductions. You'll notice Title II, which is our professional development funding for teachers and leaders in the district, we lost about $30,000. Title III is our English learners. That dropped about $30,000 also. And Title IV, which is well-rounded education, arts, music, science, effective use of technology, we lost similarly close to $30,000. A couple saving graces that have come in. There is a sub-grant within Title III. Because we are one of 6 districts across the state that saw a massive increase in our refugee population, we were eligible for an additional $30,000 in emergency funds for those students. So in fiscal year 22, we had 395 students reported. Last year in fiscal year 24, we were up to 606. So we here in Phoenix, in general, the metropolitan area is a huge center for placing refugee students. And so we're going to continue to see those numbers rise. Hopefully the additional funding will also be available to support their specific unique needs. Another area that's not with this does have to do with our Native American students. So it's a separate funding, but it's still connected to all of the school improvement things. We have a grant called Johnson O'Malley, and it's just an additional way to ensure that that subgroup of students receives everything that they need to be successful. Again, we were fortunate. While our student population did decline from about 571 students down to 491, there was a change in the funding allocation. Up until last year, we were actually granted allocations based on the 1995 student counts. And so from 1995 to 2023, we were receiving the same student count allocations, which was about $12,000. As of last year, even though our student counts declined slightly, they readjusted all the formulas, and so our allocation did increase to $18,000. Still not a huge amount, but a little more than before. This is just a comparison of our targeted school improvement grant. And again, this is a subsection of Title I, but it was definitely a hot topic recently of discussion. So I wanted to walk you through what has happened with this funding. So as of last year, we received just over $300,000 compared to March of this 2024. School districts were notified that grant applications were opening, as is typical in March. Based on our TSI status of schools and our enrollment, we were told we were eligible for $500,000, which, as you can see, was a great increase, and we had great plans. Initial funding applications for grants are typically due May 1st, so ours was submitted on time, and we received substantial approval and specialist approval. Historically, the way that that has worked with grant applications, substantial approval means that we've submitted the funding application with a reasonable attempt at a budget. Doesn't have to necessarily be perfect, but we've made a good faith effort. And that we have submitted general statement of assurances. We've basically agreed, we know the rules of how we're supposed to spend this money. We agreed to do so. When we have received substantial approval historically on every other grant, we are allowed to allocate funding and start spending. Now with federal grants, they are on a reimbursement basis, so we don't necessarily get that funding back in until we submit receipts and reimbursement requests, which we cannot do until we receive director approval. But in all other years, we were given the green light to go ahead and spend, which is when we hit July 25th, so almost a month into the project date. We reached out to ADE based on just communication among peers across the state, reached out for some clarification, and we were told that allocations would be changing even though project date had already started, monies were already being spent, and our eligibility was reduced to $250,000. So not only did we not get what we were going to be allocated, it is even lower than prior year. As of August 16th, so a month and a half into the project date, we submitted our revised application. We had to remove project initiatives that we were going to use the funding on, and we submitted that. At that time, I don't think we received specialist and director approval until maybe last week, so almost 2 months into the project. So one thing to note is, although most of the schools who had their school improvement grant allocations cut, it's important to remember that the state can spend that school improvement money how they choose. And so one thing that's important to know is that in April of 2023, something that had been a kind of a pilot program with ADE was Project Momentum that they had started. Tom Horn and ADE decided to continue that with their own funding, and they signed a $10 million contract. So even though funding went down, we have this money that may be sent back. They had already made that commitment to spend $10 million. So instead of changing that allocation, ours got changed. Any schools that were participants of Project Momentum had their grant completely reduced. So we had chosen, based on just the goals and priorities of the district, not to apply in the spring for Project Momentum, which is why we still have the $250,000. But if we had gone that route, we would have had zero funding. At the school level, which is where most of our Title I dollars land, again, it's a formula-based approach for this allocation. Previously, you may have heard a lot of celebrations on the 100th day of school. We have little kindergartners dress up as 100-year-old people, and that's fun, but we don't really count enrollment on that day anymore for grant funding. There's been a shift to utilize October 1st enrollment data. It's much more regulated and just easier for everyone to be on the same page. We're all using October 1st. That's the new measurement. Based on those numbers, we distribute our Title I dollars to school sites through a process known as rank and serve. Here, we don't necessarily weight any one school or grade level differently. We give the per pupil allocation across the board. So however many students in poverty at school A, they each get the same amount of dollars as the same students living in poverty at school B. Now, this year, it was already mentioned that we are all, as a district, we're community eligibility provision, so CEP, where everyone can qualify for that free and reduced lunch. it still is important for our funding and for school allocations that we get that income eligibility, which the team has done a great job sending out digital nudges and opportunities for parents who they don't have to come in person. They can just digitally sign. So there's been a great push for that. Simple forms that can be done wherever parents are. There's no barrier in that. There's translated options. So that I'm really excited about that. It's going to be great. And the reason it's important to schools is because even though as a district we'll get the same pie, depending on school counts and return of income forms, they may get different allocations within that. At the site level, although the overall numbers decreased from site budgets 24 to 25, you can see the basic allocations of how schools were spending money is approximately the same. Last year, schools spent approximately 66% of their title budgets on staffing, followed shortly by added service or the hourly work beyond extra pay off contract at almost 19%. This year, the change in staffing, there is a decrease. One, it was mentioned that we do have higher costs. So for every staff member that we fully employ, we also have their medical and benefits to consider. So if our overall allocation gets smaller and our people get more expensive, we can employ less people out of this funding. But schools did shift to the 20% of the added service. If they couldn't hire full-time people, they were still pouring money into how can we utilize our people to support students and their activities and learning. Dollar-wise, staffing, we went from closer to 2 million down to 1.5 million. So again, we weren't sure when first allocations came out what that would look like, and we didn't want anyone to be promised a funded position and then have to take that back. So that is part of where the staffing is reduced, and everything else is slightly reduced based on last year. And I think we've come to the end of my presentation, but I'm sure you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much for putting the time into this. This is not an easy job. And something that we hear often is that admin costs are so high, right? And what are we going to do about admin costs? So I just want to go through this for a second. So you submitted what we thought we were going to need, and you were approved for it. And then you were weighted, and then you got like a second pat on the back. Yep, go. You go. You start to utilize your funds at the level that we needed to use them on. And then you're stopped. And then somebody came and took your money. And then you had to go and resubmit again a full application / grants process, which if anybody in this room has ever done anything similar to that, it is a long process. There's no like fill out your name, social security number, the amount of money that you need and hope that somebody picks it up. So then you resubmit it and then we hold. And so I'm right? That you put hours, and then you put hours.
Yes.
And then you change it up and then you put hours. And you put hours?
Multiple times so Title I, we submitted with that assumption that
Okay.
this is the money we're gonna get. I submitted it on time, and then the next day, they changed things, so it got sent back. It also happened with our TSI, for the Targeted School Improvement Funds. And I think that one, especially because there is a lot of supporting documentation, things that we're doing should always be research-based, but especially for that grant, it is a requirement. So yes, lots of writing and rewriting.
So with that said, I want to thank you for staying here and working for us and continuing to do that, because I know that you could get paid with the level of experience that you have doing that, probably more than you are here. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that for our kids. And thank you for letting us know what's going on. I do want the public to be aware that if we didn't have admin professionals like you, like being a watchdog to not apply for another program that was being encouraged for everyone to apply to, where we would have ended up with a goose egg zero, that's why we have professionals like you here, and that's why we pay those costs. But we have to. And if people want to see these costs go down, I think we should probably help in a fair system. This is not a very good equitable system at the moment, especially when we're using this system to be all about equity. So I just want to thank you
Thank you.
for doing the job that you're doing, and I want to thank the district for putting up with this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for your presentation. I really love that you created this legend of title funding because I occasionally forget, and so this makes it very clear cut on what the funding is utilized for. But I'm still a little bit unclear on the TSI funding. So that's the state holds so kind of reversing to understand what exactly transpired and what's been in the media. The census, which we do every 10 years, we can take a lot of data from that, and one of the things is poverty levels. So not necessarily that poverty went down in Arizona, but that could be a variety of factors like less people completing their census, therefore appearing that our poverty weights have gone, our levels have gone down. So that impacts our funding, not just school funding, but lots of other funding. Mm-hmm. And so this particular set of funding, our title funding, has gone down. And so what I'm trying to understand is with the TSI funding, that's set aside from the state because they don't know every year what, I guess, or they didn't know based on the new formula what was going to be taken back. Is that correct?
So I would like to go back to the visual. So historically, they have to set aside that 7% of title. So one, there was that small the reduction, which they were anticipating but weren't sure at the time because these allocations are given to us in March. Well before the budget is finalized and passed. It's always their best hope of, we think this is what it'll be, so we'll give you a little bit more later. Hopefully they don't take any back. But for whatever reason, they decided to allocate almost double. I'm not sure the rationale for why the state increased that amount in addition to the $10 million contract that they signed for this other project. My best guess would be they just didn't realize that that large amount of money was expiring, and so they thought they had this additional money that they should get out to schools. But unfortunately, because of grant deadlines and project dates, if something like ESSER ends September 30th, I can't pay for things in October. So if their intention was to take that extra money that was left to give to us, I can't use it for the rest of the year. Hence, they had to backpedal a little bit and cut our allocations. This is less to do with the poverty levels and more to do with the state choice of budgeting.
And because our poverty levels, you said, increased from 60% to 70% or 75%?
75.
Okay, so that's a pretty big jump for our poverty levels in addition, but had you not stuck with this particular model, like Allison, or you had mentioned, we would have not had any money if you would have, based on what they had presented last year.
We had the opportunity in March when all the grant applications opened. There was a project, a grant application that was competitive we could apply for or not for Project Momentum. So any of our schools, we could have applied to have them participate in this program. It's an instructional model that the state is wanting to utilize with various coaches employed by them. After talking with Dr. Driscoll and looking at the expectations and the ramifications of applying for that, we chose that wasn't really a priority for what we were doing in the district at this time. So that's why we didn't end up applying. We could have, but I'm glad we didn't.
Yeah. So we already have allocated or planned to allocate the money that we thought we were going to get, which we're not going to get anymore.
Correct.
So moving forward, how can we ensure, obviously, there's nothing we could have done to prevent that, but how can we, could that happen again, I guess?
I never know what the state will do. They have some creative ideas as far as budgeting and grant options for us. Really, I think this is the first year across the state, people in my position, I've heard repeatedly that this was a surprise. They're moving the goalposts on us. Like I said, historically, there is no question ever, everyone knows the dates. March 1st, applications open. If you get them in by May 1st, you're approved, you're good to go to start spending July 1st. You just can't ask for reimbursements until you're director approved. This is the first time that I believe this has ever happened. And I think that's part of why a lot of the communication out there has been this level of distrust of what's happening with the Department of Education.
Well, I appreciate your work in this, and thank you for keeping us informed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
You did an excellent job, and I might be asking you for the template if I ever have to do it.
I thought you might.
I wanted to identify something or just highlight something that you mentioned about pay raises. And while we all love increases in pay, and the school board is very supportive of trying to get as much money as possible into employees' hands, we have to remember, like you said, that pay raises negatively affect the impact federal monies can have. And so while we all cheer yay pay raises, every federal programs director is freaking out about who they have to maybe eliminate or decrease in hours because it impacts the money that we get. I did want to ask about equitable services, the private schools specifically. I think you started to talk about how they get their proportionate share of the money that's allocated to us, and we work as the pass-through entity for them. But could you explain a little bit of our requirements of identifying private schools and our requirements to communicate with them about what money they can have?
Yes, so there is a requirement that as far as Title I students, so if there is a student who would be ours, who qualifies for Title I funding, but they go to a private school, their allocation goes with them. As far as Title II and IV, it doesn't necessarily have to be a student who would have come to us, but if those schools are within our boundaries, our areas, those allocations are sent based on however many students they have enrolled. And so right now, the process entails us reaching out to all the schools. It's our job to identify who would be in our boundaries, who would qualify. We reach out and we have to discuss, hey, this is what you would qualify for. Do you want to use the money or not? It is rare that they say no, at least for our district. I know some other districts have various schools, private schools who say no, thank you. But we have at least 10 participate, which you can imagine. We have 20 title schools in our district. We have 10 private schools who choose to participate. And so we are required to not only reach out and communicate and say, you qualify for this amount of funding, but then we essentially have to walk them through the entire process for the entire life of the grant, continuously updating them. Here's the balance left in your grant. Here's the balance left. We need to be sure we're spending this down. These funds are intended for this year's students. So what's your plan? What's your plan? And they don't have access to our procurement system, our financial system. So that is yet another burden on us. We have to submit requisitions, purchase orders, make sure things are done according to all of the procurement rules, making sure that things are allowable. We track also the effectiveness of the use of funding, even though they're not our staff, they're not our employees. We are supposed to be asking for data to show that they're using the funds effectively. And so just to give like a little snapshot, Title II, where those funds are allocated for our use to improve our teachers and our administrators. Last year, approximately 63,000 was sent to private schools. This year it increased to 71,000. So even though our overall allocation went down, their allocation went up, and that varies based on how many students they have, how many qualifying students, and if they choose to participate. Previously, last year for Title III, which is our English learners, we didn't have anyone historically participate, and now this year, one of our private schools has decided, wow, we have a lot more English learning students and we need help, so they chose to participate. So that is more that comes off the top of our funding. Title IV, where we do well-rounded education, safe and healthy students, effective use of technology, our allocation decreased. Their allocation went from 26,800 to 37,900. This also is relevant to the IDEA special education grants. We saw a huge leap from last year at about $20,000 to this year where we're sending private schools about $70,000 of our special education grant. Did that answer your question?
Yes, you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can I follow it up with, are those schools required to pay you any administrative fees for the work that you're doing on their behalf?
Not particularly. There is an option where we could take a small, minuscule administrative fee. We have not historically done that, but it may be something that we talk about with some colleagues who do participate in that. It's like less than 5%.
I would like to think that's because we take care of our kids, no matter where they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
(901) open call to the public. We have no blue cards, so we're skipping straight to 1001. Discussion, consideration, and possible approval to award contract 25-01-28 for architectural services for Curry Elementary and Connolly Middle School. Dr. Driscoll?
I guess I'm speaking, or are you?
I can do this, Dr. Driscoll. Thank you very much. Mr. President, members of the board, Dr. Driscoll, as always, when we bring these contracts to you, I like to publicly say thank you to the community for, and the voters of Tempe for passing the 2022 bond. Our community's commitment to our students allows us to continue to provide the latest technology and state-of-the-art educational facilities. Tonight, we're recommending contract approval for design services to DLR Group for the design of our new Connolly and Curry campus. The design services will include architectural services, civil engineering, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineering, structural engineering, special systems design, geotech analysis, and food service design. DLR Group is a top-ranked architectural firm that is known for bringing new and innovative design to their clients. They have an extensive background in designing educational facilities and have a proven track record with over 113 years of being in business in Arizona. DLR Group's design team includes K-12 design experts, sports experts, healthcare designers, and in-house engineering. They also have former educational staff on their team as well. So this evening, I'd like to also thank the TD3 Selection Committee for their time and effort they spent in this selection process. Our voting committee consisted of our superintendent, Dr. James Driscoll, our chief financial officer, Eric Thompson, our chief of staff and strategic partnership, Brittany Franklin, our director of innovative environments and school design, Jennifer Nussbaum, and myself. I'd also like to acknowledge Lupita Gomez. Lupita did an amazing job overseeing this entire process. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. David Schmidt, principal in charge, and Miss Katrina Leach, principal at the LR. So. And at this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did review most of the attachments in detail. It seemed like a reasonable price to me compared to what we pay at ADOT for similar sorts of things, so thank you, DLR. I've forgotten, in the past, you've designed some of our other schools, is that correct? How many were those? Yeah. We built them, I know that.
So the question was past schools that we worked on with Tempe.
Yes,
A little bit.
All right, does that sound better? All right. So past schools we worked on with Tempe, Shamley, formerly Laird, Arredondo opened in 2017. Shamley opened in 2016, I believe. And then McCamey Academy of International Studies, it opened in 21, I believe. So 3 projects previously.
thank you. I thought they were good projects.
Thank you.
Particularly the one up in my neighborhood. So that's,
And then it says how long you've been on the board too, because I think you were here for all of them.
I was. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dave, do you mind, because I know that we have these little footnotes that we were able to read, but can you kind of go through the schedule for the community to know what to expect as far as dates and what, like the process for the community to understand what's happening? Does that make sense, what I'm asking? What are our dates? So,
yeah.
and that might be for Dave or you, but right now you're in design process, then
Well, they're not really in design process because you have to approve them.
Oh, we have to approve them. You're not in design process until we approve, but if you were to be approved tonight, what dates would you like us to know about?
Well, it's already Wednesday, so most immediately, it's Friday. I'd love to meet with you guys. Yeah. Does that sound good? Okay. Okay, all right. Pending approval, I'd love to meet with you guys on Friday. But jumping into, if we were to be approved tonight, we really looked at the first 60 days as kind of that key window of putting together, like getting everybody's ideas and sort of formulating a big idea of what it is we're looking to do. And so that's kind of the almost like pre-design and pre-design phase, what we call programming, and then jump into schematic design. And then with that's the point which we would be mid-fall and have an idea what we're going to build, what it's going to look like, how we're going to site plan. And then we go into engineering it and trying to figure out how to build it exactly. And then construction documents, which we'd be wrapping up next spring, so mid-spring. The intent would be to be looking for approvals from the city of Tempe for permits and so forth so that we could get started with whatever we can do spring break. Of course, we have students in the school through May, so we can't do a ton, but we can start mobilizing and getting ready to go, and then really hit the ground running with the contractor, the CM, construction manager, in May and June. So this, as you may know, the students are out, will be moved out of the school next year, and so we've got a window of about 13 to 14 months to really go hard. So I think if you think of a school of this size, it's probably more than a 14-month schedule, but we will have something open for the 2026 fall semester to move students back in.
I just heard a panic, though, among all of the parents that are surrounding our places. The students will be moved. Dr. Driscoll, can you please expand on that?
Yeah, so our plan to get the school built in a time.
Don't feel like you did anything wrong. You didn't. Just-
Thank you.
This is just telling the community what's going on.
Our plan would be, if we can, to get the project done as soon would be to move students out like we did with the Shamley project, where we moved students to Meyer, which is currently our Meyer Montessori. Having an unoccupied campus gives us the time to be able to do it quicklier. Not quicklier is not a word, quickly. If we don't do that, then construction time, we couldn't guarantee that the school would open within a year. And so what Mr. Smith is not saying is they used a word that we're being very aggressive. And reason being is that every year that we wait, it costs us more. And so if you just think about Geneva Epps Mosley, when the board approved that, the cost of it was a lot less than what it actually was when we actually built it this past year. And so I want to be fiscally responsible for our community, but also I want to stretch our dollars out as much as we possibly can. So every year that we wait to build, the uncertainty of the costs, and I don't think the costs will go down. I'm imagining they'll keep going up. And so that's why we're trying to be aggressive. But the first part of that process is to get an architect. And then the second part is we have to get a construction CMR. And after those groups come together, they might tell me that we're really being too aggressive. And so they'll kind of dictate that. And depending on what they can give us in scale will be if we decide if we can move students out, if that's feasible, or we might say, nope, we can, and we'll have to do a whole another game plan, which makes the project go longer in construction.
Thank you.
Monica?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's really important, I think, to all of us that if you're to be proved that our school architecture is safe, beautiful, and functional. And Dr. Driscoll, I would like to recommend highly that we include teachers in this design process to ensure that these spaces are all those things, especially functional for them, because whether it's elective special teachers, that this space works for them, or SEALS teachers in special education or general ed teachers, I would really like to see them at the top of that committee to ensure that these classrooms work for them and their students.
I don't know if I respond. Thank you. I'll take notes.
Thank you, President Miller. I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like we don't have a minute to lose. I actually have a kid at Connolly, and my sixth grader really would love to finish eighth grade at the site that he chose. So I would like to quickly make a motion to award contract 250128 for architectural services for Curry Elementary and Connolly Middle School. Please second quickly, because they don't have any.
Second.
We have a motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. 10:02, discussion, consideration, and possible approval of a memorandum of understanding between Tempe Elementary School District and Maricopa County through the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Dr. Driscoll.
Mike, you want to talk about this one?
Sure. Dr. Driscoll, members of the board. We were actually approached by Maricopa County Sheriff's representative, is actually the school safety program coordinator. And they were looking to identify schools that they serve to support with this program, this partnership that they have with Motorola. And so Frank School, who obviously is supported by Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, was actually the first school that was selected. So we were the first school that was addressed by this proposal to use this RAVE 911 emergency response button as a pilot. And so the first step that we did was approach the school to see if they had any interest in doing so. So we talked to Martha Jacobo Smith, and she said that they would love to have more information and pilot it. So Maricopa County actually went out to meet with the staff members at Frank, explain what the program would be. It's an opt-in program to support the staff. And so the next step, if you approve this memorandum here, that they would go and train the Frank staff on how to use it.
Anybody have any questions?
No questions. I'd like to make a motion to approve the memorandum of understanding between Tempe Elementary School District and Maricopa County through the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office.
Second.
A motion by Charlotte, seconded by Allison. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aye, motion carries. Okay. 10:03. Second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy ACA sexual harassment. Dr. Driscoll, I believe these have the updated language that was spoken about last meeting.
Yes, and thank you for bringing it up. Heather, are you the navigator of this? Or is it me? Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Any further questions by the board about this update language? Do I have a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the proposed changes to governing board policy ACA sexual harassment.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Jim. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. 10:04, second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy ACAA, sex discrimination.
Again, on this one, we had our general counsel look at this as well, and then made changes based on that.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt proposed changes to governing board policy ACAA sex discrimination.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Jim. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aye, motion carries. 10:05, second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy GBK, staff grievances.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt the proposed changes to governing board policy GBK, staff grievances.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Jim. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. 10:06, second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy GCF, professional staff hiring. Any questions or comments on this?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt the proposed changes to governing board policy GCF, professional staff hiring.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Jim. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. 10:07, second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy JII, student concerns, complaints, and grievances. Any further questions here, or do I have a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt the proposed changes to governing board policy JII, student concerns, complaints, and grievances.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Jim. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aye, motion carries. And our last policy of the night, 10:08, second review and adoption of proposed changes to governing board policy BBBA, board member qualifications.
Will you guys look at this one, because this is the one that we had try to see if we captured what you wanted for this one.
Monica gives a thumbs up, so I'd like to make a motion to approve adopt the proposed changes to governing board policy BBBA, board member qualifications.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Monica. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. 10:09, discussion, consideration, possible approval of the revision to fiscal year 2024-2025 annual expenditure budget.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the revision to the fiscal year 24-25 annual expenditure budget.
Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Monica. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. 11:01, student activity report. Any comments on that? 12:01, board information. Allison, do you have anything?
Main things, everyone get your checkups. everyone qualify for cool programs at your school doing your checkups. And parents, please talk to your kids about fentanyl. Thank you, Mr. President.
No further board information. 1301, announcements, upcoming events. The ASBA 48th Annual Law Conference will be September 4th to the 6th at the JW Marriott Camelback Inn Resort. The 2024 ASBA Delegate Assembly will be September 7th at the same location. The East Valley School Boards Consortium will be hosted by Higley Unified School District on Monday, September 9th from 6 to 8 p.m. and it will be held at their district office. There will be an agenda committee meeting on Wednesday, September 11th at 11 a.m. The next regularly scheduled governing board meeting is Wednesday, September 18th, 7 p.m. The ASBA Maricopa County meeting will be Monday, September 23rd at the Glendale Elementary School District. 1401, meeting adjournment.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting.
May I say, just to second that we are attending a meeting at Camelback Inn. We are not staying at Camelback Inn. There's no extravagant vacation happening, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Do I have a second? Second to adjourn. Motion by Charlotte, seconded by Monica. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aye, motion carries. We are adjourned.